Allora, buongiorno a tutte e tutti. Ora passo all'inglese, sapete che sono in inglese queste lezioni. I take great pleasure in introducing our guest today and for the next couple of weeks, Professor Daniel Dahlstrom, who is joining us from Boston University, where he has a Silberg chair in philosophy. Professor Dahlstrom has a distinguished career. He's been he was educated at Xavier and then at St. Louis. He's the recipient of numerous awards in Germany, in the US, and elsewhere. He got a Mellon Grant, Idee I, Albright, Tristan Grant, and so on. He's had also very rich teaching experience. He has studied up in Santa Clara, then he taught at Catholic University of America, and then in Leuven, in Belgium, in Luxembourg, and he's been at Boston University since 1996, I believe. He has published several books. The first one is in English. It's called Das logische Urteil, Untersuchungen zur Wahrheitstheorie des frühen Heidegger. It came out in 1994. Then in English, Heidegger's Concept of Truth from Cambridge University Press. Well, since those of you who were in my class know that this is probably the book that has been quoted most often in the last few weeks. I did a class on Kant and Husserl's and Heidegger's reading of Kant. It's a splendid work, and I'm very glad that finally today you're getting to meet in person, so you experience as Husserlians would say, Leibhaft, the author of this work in the flesh. So it's not like an empty intention anymore. It's a fulfillment for all of us, so he's not a fictional character or entity, but he is with us here today. After this book, he published also Philosophical Legacies, which collects essays on Kant, Hegel, and their contemporaries. And then there's also the Heidegger Dictionary, which was reprinted recently. And finally, a book called Identity, Authenticity, and Humility that came out in 2017. It's not the first time that Professor Dahlstrom is in Pisa. He was here in 2006 at a conference that I organized. And if you want to see traces of that presence, there's a brilliant essay in a book that I edited. The book is called Passive Synthesis in Life World, and his essay is called Lost Horizons. It's about the concept of horizon in Husserl. He's also the author of roughly 200 articles. He's also a very prolific translator, especially from German. He translated Feuerbach, Schiller, Mendelssohn, Hegel, Heidegger's Introduction to Phenomenological Research, together with a common friend, Klaus Brinkmann. He published the translation of the encyclopedia, Hegel's Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences. He also is the author of the translation of the work that he's going to comment on today and in the next lectures, Husserl's Ideas. You have it?
Yeah.
I've never seen it.
I'll get you.
This is published by Hackett. But he has also translated Brentano and Karl Marx. I think that, I am very happy that he could join us here today. And so please join me in welcoming Professor Dahlstrom. Before I let him speak, I would like to say a couple more things. The first one is that I'm very grateful to the Scuola Normale because they have a very generous allowance for incoming professors, which allowed us to make this invitation possible. And then, on a more personal note, please allow me, I know you will understand at the end, the motivation for this. I'd like to add a tiny thing. This is the year of anniversaries. We've recently celebrated Kant's 300th birthday. There's something else though. 10 years ago, in May 2014, Stanley Rosen passed away, and I'd like to remember him today. I've had the luck of having very good teachers. There are those teachers who taught me how to read Hegel, those who taught me how to read Kant, those who taught me other important things that made me what I am. But Stanley Rosen transmitted like a contagion to me the passion for philosophical thinking, because he had a very sharp and very acute and very witty mind, which I loved and miss. I know that he also gave you a hard time when you were chair, but that's not relevant now. So please, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you. Leibhaftig auf Deutsch means in the flesh, as Professor Verhaven said, but it also means the devil. How do you say devil? Teufel. Leibhaftiger is the devil. So it's not just in the flesh. I'm not the devil. But thank you very much, Professor Verhaven, for the invitation. I don't know to what degree you know Husserl, so this is to some extent introductory to Husserl's work. My plan was to go over some of the most important aspects of his early career. So I'm going to start by talking very briefly about the history of the word phenomenology. So before Husserl, 18th and 19th century uses of the term. Then I'm going to specify Brentano's role. So Brentano was a very important figure. He influenced Husserl tremendously, but they came apart, they divided. You could say that in Austria and Germany, Brentano and his school represent rivals to the burgeoning school of phenomenology under Husserl. And then the part of Husserl's early work that made his name in Germany was the critique of psychologism. And that's what I want to spend most of today on. So I want to go through the critique of psychologism. There was wide acclaim for this first part of the logical investigations. And hopefully we'll see why this made such a splash at the time. I think that's all I'll have time for. And then the next time I want to give you an overview of the 6 logical investigations. There's 6 of them. Heidegger loved the 6th logical investigation, but there are many interesting things. There's a critique of Brentano in the 5th logical investigation. So just to give you an overview of what he does in those 6 investigations. And then I'll give you start talking about Ideas One. So Ideas One was published in 1913, and it represents a break with his early work. And the break is that he now agrees that there is something like an ego. He eventually calls it a transcendental ego or pure ego. In logical investigations, he didn't think that we could identify an ego. So there's a change here from the early work, logical investigations, which in some ways is more accommodating to naturalistic readings, and the Ideas One, which introduces a transcendental dimension. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but basically, I'll go through the first 4 sections of Ideas One. The first thing is the distinction between facts and essences. That's what the book begins with. And then in that same first section, first chapter, he introduces the distinction between material ontology and formal ontology. It's extremely important for what Husserl understands by the project of phenomenology. There's also a distinction between generalization and formalization, which is also widely accepted. Heidegger used it to criticize Nator. But at any rate, that will be our next meeting. On the 29th of May next week, I'll try to get into the naturalistic misunderstandings. So this is a continuation of the critique of psychologism, but he also criticizes Platonic, a kind of Platonic idealism in that process too. Most important here in the section on naturalistic misunderstandings is Husserl's introduction of the principle of all principles. And how to interpret the principle of all principles is interesting. It's an interesting problem. In an interesting way, Heidegger accepts the principle of all principles, but he says that the principle of all principles is not itself a theoretical principle. But all the other principles that it is the principle of are theoretical. It's interesting the way that the interpretation of the principle of all principles breaks up. Basically, it's the idea that we should only accept, we should only endorse claims for which there is some given. There is some experience that affords it. So that's in broad strokes what the principle is. But anyway, that's introduced here. Naturalistic misunderstanding. Now, we'll try to talk a little bit about the natural attitude and its suspension. Husserl tries to describe what our ordinary pre-theoretical, pre-conceptual, even to some extent, experience of everyday life is. Now, Heidegger jumps on this and criticizes it. He says that the natural attitude is a naturalistic attitude. So there's some debate about how successful Husserl is in describing the natural attitude. So that's one very important thing. What does he mean by it? Before you start applying a theory or presuppositions to what you're doing, can we describe our natural attitude? But whatever it is, the job of phenomenology for Husserl is to suspend it, to put it in brackets, to not accept the claims to what exists that are present in the natural attitude. And once we've bracketed it, we're left with what he calls the phenomenological residuum. What's left over is consciousness, its contents, its structures, independent of claims about what exists or not in the way. And phenomenology has to perform this reduction to get at this pure consciousness. And once it does that, we will see that consciousness is to be distinguished from any form of natural actuality. These are titles of sections in the Ideas One. I'm not inventing these. They're all in Ideas One. So if you have the book or you get a hold of it, it might be good to read along that way. And then if we have time, we'll get to the region of pure consciousness, the scope of phenomenology, and then his definition of phenomenology in the fourth section. So the idea here is simply to talk about the early work, the logical investigations in general terms today, and then spend most of the time on ideas one. We have so that's the book, if you have it or you have access to it. If you're going to stay with us for the next three classes, it'd be good to get a hold of it. Okay. So a little bit about the history of the term phenomenology. I teach phenomenology every 2 or 3 years at Boston University. But when I was preparing for this meeting in Pisa, I went back to look at the history of the term, and I found things I didn't know before. So some of this is new for me as well. But I think it's interesting how the term had come to be used. Before I do that, I want to signal how the word phenomenology is used today. Then I'll talk about the history. So I see 3 meanings of phenomenology today. The first is it denotes whatever someone consciously experiences. And this is a use of the term that you find in contemporary philosophers of mind, analytic philosophers of mind, when they ask questions like they make claims like, we need to pay attention to the phenomenology of experience. So you're all sitting here. What is your experience? What are you experiencing as you sit here and listen to this foreign language? What are you experiencing when you're looking at the front of the room here? Are you experiencing the sides of the room, the wall? What is the phenomenology of the experience? Or sometimes you'll hear analytic philosophers of mind saying, well, that's a nice claim, but it's not supported by the phenomenology. So there's a way of considering our consciousness, and then it does confirm or not confirm a theory about the mind. Now, in 1974, there was a famous essay in the Anglo-American world by Thomas Nagel called, "What's It Like to Be a Bat?" What is bat in Italian? Pipistrello. What is it like to be a pipistrello? And since that time, there's been a tendency among philosophers of mind to distinguish consciousness into 2 kinds of properties: phenomenal properties and representational properties. So if you read the philosopher of mind Chalmers, people like him, they will make this distinction. The representational is that's representing or not something in the world. The phenomenal properties is the phenomenology. So you'll hear philosophers of mind in the analytic tradition talking about what is it like to be the president? What is it like to be a soldier? What is it like to be a student? And they're trying to capture these phenomenal properties. So that's, I think, one very prominent use of the term phenomenology today. Describing the phenomenal properties, what is it like to be a certain sort of entity? What is it like to have those experiences? And that's very prominent in philosophy of mind. Obviously, that's not the tradition that we'll be looking at with Husserl. In a more restrictive sense, phenomenology designates the sorts of examination of human existence most famously championed by Husserl and Heidegger in the early 20th century. So I think that there's interesting comparisons you could make between contemporary analytic uses of the word phenomenology and Husserl and Heidegger, but they're really different traditions. They go in different directions. They take Husserl and Heidegger's view of phenomenology takes consciousness, in Husserl's case, or experience in Heidegger's case, to be fundamental to that examination. Phenomenology, in this sense, examines the content, structures, and significance of experiences. principally, but by no means exclusively, on the part of the individual having the experience. This is an important point, that the consciousness will always be referring to an ego, in Husserl's case, or some kind of self-reflexiveness in Heidegger's, but that doesn't rule out a indefinite sharing of conscious states with others. Heidegger's famous discussion of das Man, the they, where we accept an anonymous social existence. That would be one that it is experienced by the individual, but you couldn't distinguish it from any other individual. So there is this relationship of the individual consciousness to the social consciousness, which comes out in both philosophers eventually. A little bit slower in Husserl, but it's there as well. Now, they focus on the transcendental character of experiences, or more precisely, some intentional experience. And in those cases, they examine mental phenomena insofar as things present themselves in those phenomena. In other words, they examine experiences insofar as they are world disclosing or world constituting. So I probably shouldn't get off topic here, but there are three meanings of transcendental in the history of philosophy. There's the medieval meaning. It is the predicate of all of the categories: substance, quantity, quality, relation. Being can be said of all of them, but being is not any of the categories. And the Duns Scotus define that as transcendence. That's one meaning of transcendental. Then there's the Kantian meaning of transcendental, the conditions of the possibility of a priori knowledge. Husserl and Heidegger use it in the early Heidegger use it in a little different way. They mean the ability of the mind to be outside itself, to have access to something that is not completely defined by the immanent contents of consciousness. So that's transcendental in a third sense, which builds on the other two. But it's a different sense, and it's peculiar to phenomenologists. And as I mentioned, that builds on the notion of intentionality. We'll talk about that a little later with Brentano. So phenomenology, as Husserl and Heidegger understand it, is not restricted to an analysis of phenomena immanent to consciousness. To the contrary, how things appear to someone and make themselves present to them is part of phenomenology's very subject matter. Hence, such themes as objectivity, world, and intersubjectivity lie within its scope. So this is the second meaning of phenomenology I've given you is one that is shared by Husserl and the early Heidegger. But often today you'll see phenomenology, when it's referring to continental philosophers, refusing to apply it to Heidegger. And Heidegger himself agrees with this. So in the early 1930s, Husserl criticized Heidegger's famous work, Being and Time, and said, "What is this? This guy doesn't understand my phenomenology. He's made it into anthropology. What's going on here?" He felt betrayed, and we know the story of the two of them after this. So Heidegger tells his students, he says, "Okay, I'm not going to use the word phenomenology anymore. Let Husserl have it." And in a way, that's what's happened. You will see studies of continental philosophy restricting the term phenomenology to Husserl and his tradition, which includes very important people like Levinas, Merleau-Ponty, and Sartre. But that's a different use of the term phenomenology from the one that Heidegger used in the 20s. Okay. So those are, I think, the three uses of phenomenology you will find today in the literature. But I think it's fair to say that we can see why people are interested in phenomenology. Any study of the human mind must come to grips with how things appear to us. Studies of the mind, philosophical, scientific, neuroscientific, or otherwise, are deeply invested in careful examination and analysis of how our surroundings, others, things within our surroundings mental episodes themselves, and numerous other things make themselves present to us. They present themselves in experiences that we undergo, singly and collectively, as we ascribe them to ourselves in the first person. Far from dispensing with experiences understood in this way, the study of the human mind is crucially dependent upon meticulous descriptions that take pains to capture those experiences as they are experienced from the first person perspective. To take this for granted is to neglect egregiously phenomena that are essential to the life of the mind, and to presume to forego consideration of them is debilitating for the study of the mind. The fact that such phenomena have proved remarkably recalcitrant to reductionist approaches is hardly surprising, since neurological investigations and behavioral investigations that purport to explain away such phenomena are heavily invested in some account of them. So that's a standard reply by phenomenologists to the attempt. Well, don't worry about that. Let's find out what causes this. Well, what causes what? You have to describe what the experience is that you're then trying to give a causal account. So before I go on, does anyone have any questions about what I've said so far? Given the 3 weeks of phenomenology. Okay. I can't imagine a cyclist need to be taught from another language, so it's a phenomenological experience. Okay. Now I'll turn to a brief history of the term. I'll mention the names here.
That's a good push the buttons.
That's okay. I'll just put it here. These are 4 figures in the history of philosophy who used the term phenomenology long before Husserl comes on the scene. I'll say briefly something about each of them. Lambert wrote a book called the Neues Organon, the New Organon. So Aristotle's organon was, the categories de interpretatione, prior analytics, posterior analytics, and so on. Lambert tried to write a Neues Organon, a new organon. And the new organon had 4 sciences. What he called dianoiology, the doctrine of the laws of thinking; aletheology, the doctrine of truth; semiotics, the doctrine of the designation of thoughts and things; and phenomenology, the doctrine of illusion. Lambert writes, this is 1764, by the way, 1764. As necessary as it is to distinguish the true from the illusory, there has been little forthcoming in the doctrine of reason regarding phenomenology. Its primary focus is not logical truth, but metaphysical truth, since illusion is mostly contrasted with the real. Now, the word illusion he has, that I'm translating as illusion, is shine. It is always an error when one confuses what a thing seems to be with what it actually is, and in turn, when one believes in errors insofar as they seem to be, shining, to be true. Lambert, interestingly enough, calls shine a middle thing, ein Mittelding, between the true and the false. That's an interesting use of that term. The theory of illusion, he writes, the theory of illusion and its influence on the correctness and incorrectness of human knowledge accordingly makes up the part of the science that we call phenomenology. And he says this is a propedeutic, sounds like Hegel, a propedeutic to metaphysics. The next philosopher, 1786, is Kant. the metaphysical foundations of natural science. That text by Kant takes up the concept of matter as the object of external sense in general, the fundamental determination of which is movement. So you can imagine the problems when I'm seeing a movement. Is the body moving or is the background moving? And the possible illusions by thinking it's one rather than the other. So you need a science to get this straight when you're doing physics. So this is a part of Kant's physics phenomenology. But it isn't necessarily an illusion, it's an appearance, the real appearance that we have to contend with. So the fourth part of this metaphysical foundations of natural science is entitled phenomenology. It determines matter's movement or rest merely into the relation to the way it appears to outer sense. So in that text, Kant is addressing the different ways that movement appears to us. It's interesting to note that Kant talks here about Erscheinen. Which I translated appearance. And then Kant says, our phenomenology is concerned with determining movement as a matter of transforming an appearance, not an illusion, into an experience. And he cautions against conflating the two notions, appearance and illusion. But you must have Lambert in mind. He said, we're concerned about Erscheinen, not about illusion, in the section called Phenomenology and the Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science. Far more well known than Lambert's or Kant's uses of phenomenology are the uses that Hegel puts it to. One of the things that happens when you go through life and you're as old as I am is sometimes people pass out of your daily life because they go somewhere else to work. And it's often a great loss. And I feel that way when Professor Ferrari left Boston. I'm saying that to butter him up because he knows Hegel a hell of a lot better than I do. But Hegel does have the notion of phenomenology. And his notion of phenomenology, you might say, combines both the discussion of illusion and appearance. The phenomenology, he says, is in the 1807 work, is the science of the history of consciousness. This characterization flags the fact that Hegel, unlike his predecessors, takes seriously the history of consciousness and the possibility of making a science of that history. But like his predecessors, Lambert and Kant, he concentrates on the appearances and illusions that beset consciousness as it comes to ever more replete experience of itself, making its history in the process. So there's a sense in which Hegel's use of phenomenology appeals to both illusion and appearance, the previous uses by Lambert and Kant. Now, this was new to me. Sir William Hamilton, who has anyone heard of him? He was a 19th century philosopher whom John Stuart Mill beats up on. John Stuart Mill criticizes Hamilton left and right. I think there's an essay just simply called A Critique of Sir William Hamilton's Metaphysics. But Hamilton employs the term phenomenology, and this is now mid-19th century, to designate the first division of his philosophy. So he regards philosophy as the science of the mind, and he distinguishes three divisions of philosophy: the phenomenal, the nomenological, and inferential psychology. And in his elaboration of phenomenal psychology, he introduces the term phenomenology. He says, it's a quote, "If we consider the mind merely with the view of observing and generalizing the various phenomena it reveals, we have one mental science or department of mental science, and this we may call the phenomenology of mind." I'll repeat that. If we consider the mind merely with the view of observing and generalizing the phenomena it reveals. This is the phenomenology of mind. He says later, in the phenomenology of mind, philosophy is properly limited to the facts afforded in consciousness, considered merely in themselves. So he has a phenomenology of cognition, a phenomenology of feelings, and a phenomenology of desires and volitions. So this was surprising to me that Hamilton in the mid 19th century described his philosophy as a phenomenology. And it seems that he has it in mind in a way that is anticipating Husserl's use and the use of these other German and Austrians we'll talk about next. So this is first group. The next group are Mach, Fender, and Brentano. Now, Mach is someone you might not think would have a place here, but he takes up the view that physics must have a descriptive view before it provides anything like an explanation. And he describes this approach to physics as the need to describe fully and in the simplest manner the movements that occur in nature. And so he says he's trying to present a universal physical phenomenology encompassing all the domains. He says this in an 1894 talk called The Principle of Comparison in Physics, and Husserl gives a positive review of Mach's essay. So Mach, it's clear, has a sense of phenomenology, sort of a continuation of Kant's view that physics has to pay attention to appearances, the appearance of movement. They have to make sure that they're not being deceived by what those appearances are appearances of, but that has to be done so that physics can get on to the road of explanation. Actually, Mach doesn't think causes is very important. He thinks the description is more important than causation. He talks about the fetishism of causality. So there's an interesting way in which that also anticipates Husserl, who also brackets causation. In his 1928 Amsterdam lectures, Husserl describes his phenomenology as a radicalization of the method practiced by individual physicists and psychologists. He says the sense of this method in men like Mach lay in a reaction against threatening groundlessness of theorizing in exact natural sciences. It was the reaction against the theorizing in mathematical speculations and concept formations distant from intuition, a theorizing in which neither a discerning clarity in a legitimate sense nor theoretical achievement had come about. So this is 1928. He says, my phenomenology developed as a radicalization of what Mach was doing. Obviously, it's not only that, but that's one path to Husserl's phenomenology is through the role of phenomenology in physics. Okay. I'm not going to spend much time on Fender, but I'll just mention that he wrote a book, a habilitation called Phenomenologie des Wollens, Phenomenology of Willing. And it came out a year before Husserl would use the term phenomenology to describe the second volume of his logical investigations. What makes this, I suppose, relevant is Fender collaborated with Husserl in producing the yearbook for phenomenology. So that's where many of Husserl's works are written, and Heidegger's Being and Time, Shaler's work. So Fender's use of the term phenomenology had carried over into Husserl's. I'm not sure how strong that is because Fender was a student of Theodor Lipps, and Lipps has written a Leitfaden der Psychologie, book on psychology, which contains a section called the phenomenology of feelings. Okay? And we know that Lipps is one of the targets of Husserl's critique of psychologism. So exactly how that all falls together, I'm not sure. Suffice to say that Bender understands phenomenology as something that is necessary to understand the mental sphere in its own right, giving a faithful description of it. Okay, now the person who's probably most important in Husserl's development and that uses the term phenomenology is Brentano. I'm not going to spend time on Brentano's background. It's terribly interesting. He's a philosopher of substance, to be sure. He was an Aristotelian scholar who studied under Trendelenburg in Berlin. But he wrote a book, I'm going to skipping ahead here, in 1874 called Psychology from an Empirical Point of View, empirical standpoint. And this, for the purposes of the influence on Husserl's phenomenology, is the most important work. Husserl originally referred to his logical investigations as a descriptive psychology. And this is the expression that Brentano uses in his lectures from the mid-1880s on. So he contrasted descriptive psychology with genetic psychology. There's also a famous essay, 1899, by Dilthey, that also makes this distinction between descriptive and genetic phenomenology. I'm sorry, descriptive and genetic psychology. The descriptive psychology becomes the phenomenology. Now, the reference to an empirical point of view is somewhat misleading, particularly in the Anglo-American context, because of the empiricism of Locke or Hume. Brentano's psychology is not an empirically descriptive science, as that might be understood in that context. He writes in 1895, "My school distinguishes a psychonosis and genetic psychology. The one points up all the ultimate mental components from the combination of which the entirety of mental appearances present themselves, like the entirety of words come about from letters. The other discipline teaches us about the laws according to which appearances come and go." So you have these two senses of psychology: descriptive psychology, simply trying to describe the elements out of which consciousness is constituted, the ultimate elements. And then you have a genetic psychology, which tries to explain its causal connections, the laws of the mind. But they're distinct. So the descriptive psychology is later also called by Brentano phenomenology, and Husserl will eventually use that same language. But Husserl too will first call what he's doing descriptive psychology, and then sort of admitting it a mistake when he reissues the investigations 10 years later. He says, well, what I meant was phenomenology. Okay, so that's how the word choice is developed. But there's another importance to Brentano that has to be mentioned in talking about the history of phenomenology. And that is that one of the aims of the psychology from an empirical standpoint is to identify what is today called the mark of the mental. What is the characteristic that defines mental phenomena in contrast to physical phenomena? So the psychology from an empirical standpoint was trying to identify what it is that psychology studies, not what neuroscience necessarily studies. And so he talks about, some philosophers say, well, there's no such thing, there's nothing common. Alexander Bain said that in England. But
good classical philosopher that he is, Brentano says, psychologists already in ancient times have called attention to a particular kinship and analogy that obtains among all mental phenomena, while physical phenomena have no share in it. So there's something that has been recognized since Plato and Aristotle that is the mark of the mental that has nothing to do with the physical. The physical has nothing to do with it. And then he says, so I'm quoting from, this is a famous passage from the Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint. Every mental phenomenon is characterized by what the scholastics called the intentional inexistence of an object, and what we might call, albeit not without some ambiguity, reference to a content, orientation to an object, which is not to be understood here as a reality or the immanent objectiveness. So when you look at the board here, supposing this is the object of your perception, what's the content? Is the content something other than the object? Does it coincide with the object? That's the ambiguity he's talking about. And that actually becomes quite important, because if we are able to transcend ourselves, we are able to have things present themselves to us, then we have to be able to get to the object and not just the content, because the content could just be immanent. So that's why that's a rather important point. But the key notion here, the mark of the mental, is clear. It's what is called the intentionality of the mind. So he explains it this way. In the presentation, something is presented. In judgment, something is acknowledged or rejected. In love, something is loved. In hate, something is hated. In desire, something is desired, and so forth. So it seems that all mental acts are directed at objects and or contents, leaving that ambiguity aside for the moment. So Brentano has identified the mark of the mental, and this has become commonplace in not just continental philosophy, but analytic philosophy of mind. Intentionality is sometimes referred to as the aboutness of consciousness, that it's about something. And you could identify a relationship between the specific object and the act. Dreaming, dreamt. Seeing, seen. Perceiving, perceived. Loving, loved. These are all mental acts that take an object. Yes. The emotional? Oh, mood. Yeah, okay, great question. So there's a problem with this theory where Husserl and Brentano come apart, and it has to do with sensations. So Brentano thinks that this holds for every mental act. So when you have a pain, there must be something it's directed to. And Husserl follows his teacher, Karl Stumpf, and says, no, there's a limit to intentionality. It doesn't apply to pains and pleasures. He calls these Gefühlsempfindungen, Husserl does, in the fifth logical investigation, which is part of the critique of Brentano. But Brentano sticks to his opinion. So the question is, well, what does the pain point to? What is it directed at? What's the answer? I fell down the stairs a couple weeks ago, and I still got the pain here. The pain is directed at a part of the body. So Brentano says, yeah, even pains and pleasures are intentional. They're directed at where the pain is. But you ask a more complicated question. What about moods? What about Heidegger's angst? Does it take an object? That's not an easy question to answer. Husserl doesn't answer that directly. But it's a great question. It's where the analysis of moods, intentionality may not work there. Unless you say somehow on is directed at the meaninglessness of existence or the nothingness of existence. Does that help? Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's this problem of how far this goes and whether you want to set limits to it. But for most of the acts of the mind, we can say, yeah, it seems like they have to be given an intentional analysis. Okay. So this intentional inexistence is peculiar to mental phenomena exclusively. Why? Because for a relation to hold in the physical world, the two things that are related have to both exist. But I can imagine something that doesn't exist. I can imagine Superman. I can imagine someone who's long gone in my life. They don't have to be there for the relation to hold. So that's this distinctiveness of intentionality. It's a relation between the act and the object, but the object doesn't have to exist. So that's why the mark of the mental here, it says that all mental phenomena and only mental phenomena exhibit intentionality. Now, there's some people who try to push back against that today and want to say there's some kind of proto-intentionality in nature, but that's not where Brentano and Husserl go. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Brentano's really an interesting figure. He distinguishes three classes of mental phenomena: presentations, judgments, so something is or is not the case, and love and hate. He has a very interesting account of good and bad. The good is what is rightfully loved, and the bad is what is rightfully hated. So it's a question of whether he's caught in a circle there because he adds the word rightfully to the. But it's one possible theory of the objectivity of values. So there's the objectivity of values, and then we are aware of them because they're rightly loved, but they're not values because they're rightly loved. They're rightly loved because they're good. So he has an objective account of values, which was fairly influential at the turn of the last century. He also has a theory of ontological reism, the view that only things are properly said to exist. So I'll leave it at that. So, but anyway, Brentano is worth your time. But the most important things for us to see is the identification of the mark of the mental as being the intentional. Husserl takes that over. Okay? And in a way, Heidegger does too. Because Heidegger says that intentionality presupposes transcendence, transcendence presupposes being in the world. So there's, in both Husserl and Heidegger, this recognition of something called intentionality is to be found. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Okay, I hope I'm not losing too many. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Husserl's intellectual life. You're so far from me. I'm not a close talker, but you're pretty far away, so I can come up here, if you don't mind. So Husserl was born in 1859, died in 1938 by Wood. He was a Moravian. It's that part of Czechoslovakia that's between Bohemia and Slovakia. He was of Jewish background, but baptized into the Lutheran religion. So that, of course, be a problem in the 1930s. He studies mathematics under Weierstrass and Königsberg, so he was studying with some famous mathematicians, and then he studied philosophy under Brentano. Now, there's another part of Brentano we didn't mention. Brentano was a priest, and he was an old Catholic. An old Catholic didn't accept the papal infallibility of Vatican Council I in 1870. And so the Austrian government took away his permission to direct dissertations. So Husserl couldn't write it in the time. So Brentano says, okay, go up and study with my former student Karl Stumpf. So that's, Husserl is a student of both Brentano and Karl Stumpf. He dedicates the logical investigations to Karl Stumpf. Stumpf's another interesting figure here. You want to talk about it. Okay, Husserl writes The Philosophy of Arithmetic, Psychological and Logical Investigations in 1891. This is important, this particular essay, because it's an attempt to explain the psychology behind arithmetic. And it receives a critical review in 1894 by Gottlob Frege. Some people think that Frege's critique of this early work is part of the spur for Husserl to write logical investigations. There's something to that, although it's more complicated because the philosophy of arithmetic doesn't betray any of the psychologism which you actually criticize. Okay, he writes the logical investigations in 1901. We'll talk about those in a moment. He edits the Yearbook for Philosophy and Phenomenological Research. And then Ideas I in 1913. This work will spend most of our time on. His two sons fought in the war. One dies at Verdun. He moves to Freiburg in 1916, stays there till 1928. He meets this young upstart, Heidegger. They become regular interlocutors. They meet every Saturday, and a lot of people come there and listen to them talk to one another. That lasted 2 or 3 years. He actually was so very important to Heidegger's development. But when he retires in 1928, he still thinks that Heidegger is going to be continuing kind of work that Husserl introduced. And Heidegger takes over Husserl's chair. He writes the Cartesian Meditations, or gives the Cartesian Meditations in Paris in 1929. That's important because it introduces the notion of intersubject phenomenology. It's the fifth meditation. And then he writes the Crisis of European Humanity, Crisis of European Sciences. He gives lectures in Prague and in Vienna, 35 in Vienna, because he's no longer allowed to lecture in Germany. And a lot of things to mention. You see that Ideas I, there must be a follow-up, and there is. There's Ideas II and Ideas III. And Ideas II is where Husserl introduces the notion of the capacities of the ego, so-called ich kann, I can, I am able. And this requires an understanding of our embodiment. And in 1938, Ideas II wasn't published yet. It won't be published until the early 50s. But a young Frenchman goes to Leuven and studies Ideas II. And that's Merleau-Ponty. So Merleau-Ponty, this is no secret, he wasn't trying to hide the fact. Much of his work is a critical engagement with Ideas II, where Husserl does introduce the question of body. Okay, I won't go through. There's a lot of other works that just want to give you a general idea of the scope of Husserl's writing. Husserl's works published in what's called Husserliana. And there are 66 volumes. So it's a lot. So I come here lecturing you, talking to you about Husserl. I haven't read all 66 volumes. So I can give you a snippet of what I've read, but there's a lot there, and people continue to mine. There's a great deal of wisdom in many of his works that are still being used. But if you're interested in the whole collection, it's mostly edited and published out of Leuven. It's an interesting story about how they were saved in the Nazis. His writings and taken to Leuven at the end of the 1930s. Okay. Any questions about Husserl, or there's part of Husserl that you've heard about, that you'd like to talk about? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I have two questions. One is, what do you think about the influence of other thinkers like Lotze or Bolzano or Husserl's thought? Because, for example, he refers to the mark of the mental, and Michael Dahlstrom, who has an interpreter of Husserl's, is very difficult to be the least, but and to say the least, but Michael Dahlstrom say that Husserl, together with Frege, represent a thinker that works on the exclusion of the mental, of the thoughts from the mental, and if we follow just Brentano, we don't catch this point.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are 6 logical investigations, and the first 4 are sometimes referred to as the Bolzano investigation, and the last 2 are considered the Brentano. I mean, that's very grob, as the Germans say, very rough, but there's something to it. He did read Bolzano, Wissenschaft there, and the idea that there's this Satzanzig proposition in itself, this is distinguishable from the wording. That Bolzano doctrine is there in the first 4 volumes of the first 4 investigations. I was just trying to point out, and I don't mean to be exhaustive, where the word phenomenology is used. And I don't know if Bolzano uses that term to characterize what he's doing. But you're absolutely right, the Bolzano connection is there. So Bolzano was a philosopher who wrote the famous work called Wissenschaft there. I think it was in Vienna, right? It's 18 or yeah, it's early first half of the 19th century. Now Lotze is a different story. Lotze was a place where Frege studied and neo-Kantians studied. And Lotze has this view that there are 4 kinds of actuality. How I remember this right. Being is a relation obtains, an event happens, and a true proposition is valid. So you have to be, according to Lotze, you have to make sure you don't confuse beings with relations, with events, or with validity. They're all separate. So the neo-Kantians and Frege could have gotten inspiration that the validity of a proposition is not reducible to being or relations or events. That would include psychological beings, relations, and events. So there's a reading of the importance of Lotze on this whole development in psychology and Frege's development, because he identified the irreducibility of what's called gift. So I think that's quite true. And there's a great deal of discussion of Lotze in the Prolegomeni.
Then, I'm very sorry. They write me, people who are listening from home, that once you are out of the area where the camera is, they don't see you, but more importantly, they cannot hear you well. So I know you like teaching as you walk, but if you do, would you mind using the microphone?
No, not at all. No. Sorry about that. Okay. Any other questions before I go on? Okay, thank you for those questions. They're very good. So the critique of psychologism. Let's see, maybe we should take a break here. take a 5 to 10 minute break, and then we'll come back and go into the critique of psychology. So that's the first part of the logical investigation. Okay. So Husserl's logical investigations, I'm going to talk about them for the next hour, no more than that. And I'm going to talk about what's called the Prolegomena to a pure logic. And this is the first part of the logical investigations, published in 1900. The second part is the one that contains all six separate logical investigations. But this is the part of the logical investigations that had the biggest impact. So in the forward to the investigations, Husserl expresses his dissatisfaction with attempts, including his own, to clarify the logic of deductive sciences through psychological analyses. He says psychology was clear and helpful when it came to questions of origins of mathematical notions or the formation of a practical method, but the transition from, quote, the psychological connections of thinking to the logical unity of the content of thinking, unquote, was uneven and obscure. Increasingly, he came to doubt, he says, that the, quote, the objectivity of mathematics and science was compatible at all with the psychological grounding of the logical, end quote. As a result, he puts it, I saw myself forced more and more to general critical reflections on the essence of logic, and especially on the relation between the subjectivity of knowing and the objectivity of the content of knowledge. He resigned himself to postponing his philosophical and mathematical investigations until he had succeeded in penetrating the basic questions of epistemology and the critical understanding of logic as a science, end quote. So one thing that we probably should talk about briefly to make sure it's clear is that logic had a different meaning in this context than it typically does today. So famous American logician Quine, in his Methods of Logic, defined logic as the science of implication. So you're trying to understand when one sentence implies another, something like that. But Husserl's understanding of logic was what allows for science to be objective at all? What allows for logic to be valid at all? So these are larger questions, I suppose, than the question simply of implication. So when he writes Prolegomena to a pure logic, he's not thinking only of what we might think of as implication. I used to teach mathematical logic, and I always taught implication, never taught what Husserl was interested in here. So by Husserl's own account, the logical investigations has two sources. The problem of providing a scientific account of logical form and method as a condition of science. So there's a kind of reflexivity built into it. And the problem of relating the subjectivity of knowing to the objectivity of the content of knowledge. Now, there are two important clues to the work flanking the forward of the first edition. The first clue is the dedication in admiration and friendship to Karl Stumpf, Brentano's erstwhile student under whom Husserl wrote his habilitation. The second clue is a quotation from Goethe at the end of the foreword. One is against nothing more stridently than the errors one has first set aside. What makes these clues intriguing is their seeming incongruity, both with aspects of the historical record and with one another. There's a standard picture of Husserl's development in the last decade of the 19th century to the effect that Frege's criticisms in the 1894 review that we talked about enabled Husserl to see the error of his psychologistic ways in the days when he worked under Brentano and Stumpf. On this standard picture, the Goethe quotation is tantamount to an admission of such a lapse. So we're never more stridently against something than a previous behavior that we had adopted. The quotation, however, is misleading in as much as it suggests that Husserl had embraced psychologistic arguments criticized in the Prolegomeni, but there's no evidence of this in the philosophy of arithmetic. So it's not completely clear exactly what that quote means. Still, Husserl does attribute the mistakes of his earlier writings, if not explicitly to a psychologistic approach, at least to a conviction that psychology in some sense is the key to a philosophical clarification of logic. Husserl also observes that the course of his development had distanced him, quote, from the men and works to which my scientific education is most indebted, end quote. So that means, Brentano and Stumpf, that you're distancing yourself from them. Given this observation and the critique of his earlier work, his dedication to Stumpf might seem disingenuous. So the name here, I don't know what is. So Husserl wrote his habilitation under Stumpf, who was Brentano's former student. However, there's another way to read that dedication, and that is Stumpf had written a long essay entitled Psychology and Epistemology in 1892. From the, in that essay, Stumpf insists that there must be a way between empiricism and conscious transcendentalism, and that while rational justification and psychological explanation are not to be confused, quote, no claim can be epistemologically true and psychologically false. So there must be some compatibility between what's epistemologically true and what's psychologically true. So this last remark might in fact be considered one of the mottos of the first volume of the Logical Investigations, entitled The Prolegomena to Pure Logic. So let's see. I'm going to present this in about 5 steps. The first is the state of the question. The question is, what is the status of logic? Now here it's pretty straightforward. He says either logic is a theoretical, independent, formal, and a priori science, or it is merely a doctrine of art dependent on some other science, a material and empirical discipline. Starting from the widely held assumption that logic is, if nothing else, a doctrine of an art, Husserl concludes this introduction with a statement of how he intends to proceed. First, by isolating the sense in which logic is indeed a normative and practical discipline, and then raising the question of its theoretical foundations. He writes, the question of logic's theoretical foundations and relationship to psychology essentially coincides, if not in terms of the whole, in terms of the chief part, with the cardinal question of epistemology concerning the objectivity of knowledge. The result is the singling out of a new and purely theoretical science, which forms the most important foundation for each doctrine of art of scientific knowledge and possesses the character of an a priori and purely demonstrative science. So that's what he has his sights on, but he has to establish it. So the next section of the at least my presentation, but also of the Prolegomena, is to distinguish practical, normative, and theoretical disciplines. So he says the genuine and principally important question disputed concerns whether the definition of logic as a doctrine of art gets at its essential character, whether it is only the practical viewpoint which justifies the right of logic as its own scientific discipline, while from a theoretical standpoint, everything that logic assembles as knowledge, on one hand, obtains in purely theoretical propositions that are grounded in otherwise familiar theoretical sciences, but chiefly in psychology. So is the doctrine of art grounded in some other science? And one possibility is it's grounded in psychology. When I was much younger, I studied medieval logic, and William of Ockham defines logic as ars artium et scientia scientiarum, the art of arts and the science of sciences. So he has it both ways. But Husserl isn't going to allow us to do that. The art is going to be subordinate to the science. So first thing is, Husserl starts from the premise that normative considerations rest upon theoretical disciplines, insofar as their rules must possess a theoretical content separable from the normative thought, the thought of what should be. To put it in simpler terms, normative science is about what should be, theoretical science about what is. Husserl reasons that every, quote, every normative sentence presupposes a certain type of value stance, approval, estimation, through which the concept of a good, values in a definite sense, or bad, disvalue, emerges with respect to a certain class of objects. In keeping with this development, objects break down into good and bad objects. The sum total of norms forms a closed group determined by a fundamental valuation, a basic norm, the correlate of the good and bad in question. So he says, every normative discipline has its basic norm. Theoretical disciplines do not. That's the crucial distinction here. The general point is that underlying normative judgments are conditions for possessing certain value predicates, conditions that are or can be the subject matter of theoretical propositions. For example, if certain conditions are fulfilled, reliability, economy, ease of operation, strong brakes, we say that a car is a good car. Is that clear? I'll repeat it. If certain conditions are fulfilled, reliability, economy, ease of operation, strong brakes, etc., we say that a car is a good car. By the same token, we can say that a car should be reliable, economical, easy to operate. But these conditions or properties of the car make up a theoretical content separable from the evaluation of them. Okay, I hope that's clear. So next section, this is from the Prolegomena, is on normative disciplines and technologies. A normative discipline is not the same as a practical doctrine or doctrine of art for Husserl, or I think it's translated in English technology, but the German is Kunstlehre. even though we have a tendency to equate them, since a normative interest is paramount when it comes to real objects as objects of practical evaluations. The difference is this: the normative discipline explains what is right or good. The practical discipline, how to achieve it. So you have the practical discipline, the Kunstlehre, and then you have the normative discipline. The normative discipline tells you, what's right or good. The practical discipline, how to achieve it. And so he says every Kunstlehre, every doctrine of the art, includes in itself an entire normative discipline, which is not itself a practical discipline. The right way to drive a car, a Kunstlehre, a practical discipline, how to do X, includes a discipline that explains what is the right way, the normative discipline. Okay, so I hope that's clear. There's the practical discipline, the art, only if there's a normative discipline, which gives you the norm. And then the claim here is that the normative discipline is there only if there's a theoretical discipline, which is a matter of fact or a theory. So do this, then do that is first premise, only if there is something good about doing this or doing that. And there's something good about doing that because that has certain qualities, which are not valued to. This is my own example. How many of you own a car or drive a car? Okay, so hopefully this will help. Change your oil regularly. That's the art or practice. Only if it's good to change your oil regularly, that's the norm. It's good to change your oil regularly, the norm, because doing so preserves your engine. That's a fact. That's a theory. So that's the way Husserl reasons here. You've got the practical discipline, change your oil regularly. Why? Because it's good to change your oil regularly. Why? Because doing so preserves your engine. And now we're not down to any values anymore. We just have a theoretical statement. Changing your oil regularly will preserve your engine. That clear? So he's got these three things going on: the practical discipline, the normative discipline, the practical discipline because of the normative discipline, and the normative discipline presupposes some theoretical discipline. This is always very controversial, right? This relationship between norms and practices, and norms and theory, or norms and facts. But this is the way Husserl sets that up. So he says, it's now easy to see that every normative and a fortiori every practical discipline presupposes one or more theoretical disciplines as the foundation, in the sense, namely, that must possess a theoretical content detachable from all matters of norm. So you have to be able to describe that theoretical content independent of any norm, whether it's good or bad. In fact, you could only say it's good or bad if you've also first somehow established what it is on his account. So the norm functions as a measure or measuring relation between the norm and what it is a norm for. Another way to put this, and this is Husserl's language, each normative discipline demands the knowledge of certain non-normative truths that it takes from certain theoretical sciences. Okay, so that's the second part of the Prolegomeni. The third, he introduces to us psychology. Psychology, its arguments. I'll just leave it at that. So the problem that Husserl was contending with, and many others were contending with at the turn of the last century, was at the last of the previous century, is whether psychology can provide a foundation, a justification for normative disciplines. So the question that is disputed is whether the essential theoretical foundations of logic lie in psychology. So that's where we get this phrase, psychologism. It's claiming that somehow principles of logic are founded in some kind of psychological investigation, and that means some kind of description of the mental state or mental contents. What are the theoretical foundations of logic as a theory of science? Have you asked yourself that question? I'm sure most of us have, right? Philosophers ask themselves, what's the foundation of logic? Can we answer that question without tripping over our own logical feet? It's a recursive question because we apply logic. So we ask, is this statement valid? Is that statement, does that conclusion follow? Well, what about the reasoning that we're using to evaluate those things? So what are the theoretical foundations of logic as theory of science? Or are they not theoretical? Are they just practical? Or normative? Does the foundation of logic and its theoretical truths lie in separate, already established sciences? One answer, the one that was popular in Husserl's day, is that psychology provides the theoretical foundations for logic, and it does so as a separate science. So I guess I maybe should have put this on the board. Husserl's logical investigations are investigating the foundations of logic. And the Prolegomena, the first volume of the logical investigations, is asking whether does psychology provide the foundation for logic? A person or a thinker is called a psychologist, psychologistic, if they think that the foundations of logic or mathematics are grounded in psychology. So psychology becomes the science that is superordinate to logic, actually to mathematics. Well, so the one answer here is that psychology provides the theoretical foundations of logic, and it does so as a separate science. On this account, no new science is needed. Now remember, this is the first volume of Husserl's logical investigations. So it's sort of an introduction to the way he's going to treat logical investigations. It's an introduction which tries to disestablish psychologistic attempts to ground logic. So that's what the direction this is headed. On this view, logic is related to psychology. This is a quote from Husserl. Logic is related to psychology as any branch of chemical technology is related to chemistry, or as surveying is related to geometry, and so on. So psychology and logic is related to psychology as chemical technology is related to chemistry. So you've got chemistry, a theoretical science, and then you've got chemical technology. Well, the chemical technology is related to chemistry. It depends on the results given in chemistry. Well, according to the psychologistic view, logic is related to psychology in a similar way. So logic depends upon psychology for its validity. There are two people he cites, among others, but two famous people who claimed this in the 19th century. John Stuart Mill claims that logic is, quote, a branch of psychology. And Theodor Lipps, who's the Doktorvater of that we talked about earlier, Fender, yeah. He also says that logic is a specific discipline of psychology, end quote. So the idea there would be that psychology is the science that grounds logic. Psychology provides the theoretical basis for constructing a logical technology, and more particularly a psychology of cognition. Okay, so he claims that according to the psychologists, the psychologistic interpretation, logic is related to psychology as a part to a whole. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm skipping through my notes to get to the next part. Okay, is it fairly clear what is meant by psychologism? That logic is dependent upon, the validity of logic is dependent on the validity of claims made by psychology. Now, psychology is an empirical discipline from this. We're not talking about rational psychology in the Wolffian sense. It's an empirical psychology. So that would mean that logic is an empirical discipline. So that's long and short of it. Of course, it's going to be contested. The next point he brings up, these are just my notes, they're not in the text exactly, but the implications of psychology. So these are taken right from the Prolegomena. The first is there's three arguments based on against psychologism. First, based on the vagueness and inexactness of psychological generalizations. The second is the inductive probability of psychological laws of thought. And the third is the impossibility of deriving either psychological facts from logical laws or logical laws from psychological facts. So I'm going to put it on the board in a more succinct way in a moment here. These different features rule out any grounding of logic in empirical or physiological psychology, since logical laws are, by contrast, this is claimed, logical laws are exact, apodictic, and neither entail nor are entailed by any psychological generalizations. Is that clear? So this is the rejoinder to this psychologist position. Logical laws can't be grounded in empirical generalizations by psychology because logical laws are exact. There's a level at which logic doesn't countenance vagueness. They're apodictic, they're necessary. The conclusions necessarily follow from the premises, and they neither entail nor are entailed by any psychological generalizations. Okay, so now I'll go through these a little more slowly. These are all arguments from Husserl. So, if logical laws are founded upon psychological generalizations, then logical laws are inexact. but logical laws are not inexact. So modus tollens, logical laws are not founded upon psychological generalizations. You want me, I don't want to take too long to write this out. I could probably send this to you if you want these three arguments. Anyway, so that's the first argument, okay? Logical laws exact. If logical laws were based upon psychological generalizations, they couldn't be exact. They have to be inexact, they have to be vague. Modus tollens, logical laws are not inexact. Second argument, the laws are founded upon psychological laws, then logical laws are inductively determined and only probable. But logical laws are a priori and apodictically valid. That is to say, they do not have a merely probable validity based upon induction. Okay, then from that it follows that logical laws cannot be founded upon psychological laws of thought. Because the psychological laws of thought don't give you apodicticity, they don't give you necessity, absolute necessity, they only give you probability. So, you know, if P then Q, P therefore Q. Q follows necessarily, doesn't it? Or seems to. That's what we all learn. Doesn't it seem right? I mean, is it only probably the case that Q is P then Q and P? So that's the argument. The argument here is that the logical laws are apodictic. We don't have to ask ourselves how many times if P then Q, P therefore Q. This is modus ponens. Modus ponens doesn't depend on a survey. It doesn't matter how many times we appeal to it. It isn't grounded by the number of times we appeal to it. It's grounded by the necessity of if P then Q and P, then Q has to follow. Q can't be conjoined, not Q can't be conjoined with those two premises. So that's Husserl's argument here. So psychologism is, it's undermining logic. It's presuming something about logic which isn't the case. We're able to see that if P and P, Q has to follow necessarily. Not because, well, so many times we've seen this in the past. It's not an inductive generalization, according to Husserl. And the third argument, if logical laws are founded upon psychological facts, or laws governing those facts, then logical laws must imply and be implied by psychological facts, or laws governing those facts. But, this is a quote from Husserl, no logical law implies a matter of fact, end quote. Nor is any logical law implied by a matter of fact. So, logical laws neither are entailed by any psychological generalization, nor do they entail it. I mean, we all learned this in logic. We all learned modus ponens. Put it again. If P then Q, P therefore Q. This logical law that Q necessarily follows with P then Q and P is exact, it's apodictic, and it doesn't entail, nor is it entailed by any psychological generalization. It has a validity on its own, modus ponens. So the logical law doesn't imply a matter of fact. I mean, you could put in here, I had some silly example. If Italy plays the World Cup, then Germany loses. Italy plays for the World Cup, Germany loses. That doesn't imply any fact of the matter. It's a statement of the relationship between propositions. So no logical law implies a matter of fact, nor is any logical law implied by a matter of fact. This is the prolegomena to a pure logic. So logic doesn't rest on any of these empirical generalizations. So Husserl concludes. Okay, so he says, sums this up, a consistent psychologism would require interpretations of logical laws that would be fundamentally alien to their genuine sense. Maybe we should put that expression on the board. What he's criticizing here today is he's trying to present us arguments against psychologism. By psychologism, he means the view that logic can be derived from the study of psychology. A consistent psychologism would require interpretations of logical laws that would be fundamentally alien to their genuine sense. It overlooks that the generally understood laws of logic presuppose something psychological, neither in terms of their grounding nor in terms of their content. So it doesn't, the laws of logic don't presuppose something psychological in terms of their grounding, nor in terms of their content. Any comments or questions about that? I mean, that's the pivotal part. I'm going to go on and talk some more, but I mean, what Husserl is calling attention to is this distinctiveness of logical laws, their exactness, their apodicticity, the necessity, and that they don't tell us anything. They neither entail nor are they entailed by any psychological generalizations. It's an ideal science in that sense. And he would take psychologism, the attempt to reduce logic to psychology, as a confusion. It's confusing what is real with what is ideal. Because logic is ideal. So, but it's still a science. It still has necessary connections. Okay, any comments or questions? I should go on. All right. Now, fifth point. Is three psychological prejudices, psychologistic prejudices. So here Husserl continues his assault on psychologism. Oh, by the way, just remember, all the texts here I'm referring to are from the first volume of the Logical Investigations, 1900. So the first volume, the Prolegomena to a Pure Logic. So the three prejudices of psychologism are: one, since prescriptions that regulate the psychological domain are obviously grounded psychologically, so must the normative laws of knowledge be grounded in the psychology of knowledge. Would be one prejudice. Second prejudice, logic cannot be distinguished from psychology, since the content of logic, for example, judgments and inferences, refer to psychological phenomena. Three, the truth of a judgment depends upon evidence, that is ultimately a peculiar feeling, in other words, something of a psychological character. So I'll repeat those one more time, just to go through it quickly, so we don't lose the thread of the argument. Husserl's trying to identify three prejudices of psychologism. The first, the prescriptions that regulate the psychological domain are obviously grounded psychologically, and hence the normative laws of knowledge must also be grounded in the psychology of knowledge. Second, logic cannot be distinguished from psychology since the content of logic refer to psychological phenomena, judgments and inferences. And thirdly, the truth of a judgment depends on evidence that is ultimately a peculiar feeling, in other words, something of psychological character. What color is this? Someone tell me. What's the word in Italian? Rosso? Rosso? Okay. The evidence that this is rosso is what? Does it have to be rosso? But in fact is rosso. And you know it's rosso, the verification is a certain feeling. It can't be something else. It has to feel this way. So he has this, he repeats this argument of other philosophers who says that the truth of a judgment depends on evidence that is ultimately a peculiar feeling. I can't feel that this is yellow. It has to be rosso. Okay. Here's his responses to each prejudice. Logical laws are not prescriptions. It's necessary to distinguish the laws which serve to establish the norms for activities of knowing from the rules which govern the thoughts of this normative process itself. I'll repeat that. It's necessary to distinguish the laws which serve to establish the norms for activities of knowing from the rules which contain the thoughts of this normative process itself. He says, for example, a plus b and a minus b equals a squared minus b squared is a theoretical law, not a practical rule. Second, logic's content, like that of mathematics, comprises not realities, like facts of judging, inferring, counting, but ideal unities. The number 5 is an ideal species of form, modus ponens, form of inference. With this difference in content comes the difference between ideal and real sciences, and the difference between the psychological experience of knowledge and the logical connections among theoretical ideas that make up the unity of the discipline's truths. So I'll repeat that in just my own terms here. Logic's content, like that of mathematics, comprises not realities, not facts, but ideal unities. And we're confusing those ideal unities with our empirical or our empirical grasp of them when we say that its content is real. Logic content is something ideal, not a reality like the reality of my experience of judging or inferring. Then he says, this is the third point here, the truth of the sentence A plus B equals B plus A rests solely upon the givenness of the ideal entity expressed by it to an actual experience, regardless of any feeling that attaches to it. Not sure if we want to accept that, but let's go run with it, try to see what it means. The truth of the sentence A plus B equals B plus A. The truth of that sentence, he says, rests solely upon the givenness of the ideal unity expressed by it, regardless of any feeling that attaches to it. So he's trying to say that there's the way in which this is given to us, that this is these two are identical, but it's not, doesn't rest on a feeling, as the psychologistic position he seems suggest would have to say. All three prejudices, Husserl concludes, amounts to a confusion of the real with the ideal, apologistic prejudices rest on confusions of the real with the ideal. With the act of judging, with the content. Yeah, I'll stop there. So the psychologistic position, from Husserl's point of view, confuses these two levels. It doesn't recognize that there's a distinction between the real and the ideal. So if we agree that if P then Q, P therefore Q holds, regardless of how many times we see it realized in life or not, then we're talking about something which is an ideal relation between the principles that P then Q, P and Q. We're not talking about what is real. Now, what's real is our thinking of this, our act of thinking it, our act of inferring, our act of judging. But the structure of the validity that follows from if P then Q, P is an ideal validity. It also is the content of what we're thinking as opposed to the act of thinking. This is Husserl's attempt to, underscore his rejection of psychologism in the first part of the logical investigations. Now, it goes on quite a bit. There's a Machiavellarius biologism, which is related to psychologism, which he goes on to criticize in the text. But I won't go there now. That would take us too far afield. I think we've covered the main points of the Prolegomena to a pure logic. It's a critique of what was a dominant position at the time, psychologism, that logic could somehow be based in psychology. Husserl, as one might expect, was torn about this originally because he was looking for an account of how human consciousness works when it does logical work, so logical investigations. But he came to the conclusion, and this was also something he shares with Frege, that it's not reducible to some account of our psychology. It's an ideal science. Even when we put these terms here, if P then Q, P therefore Q, this stands for some possible proposition in relation to some other possible proposition, but no actual proposition needs to be entertained. So it's at the level of ideal relationships between if P then Q, P and Q. Put it in a conjunction, if P then Q and P, I couldn't also write and not Q. End up with a contradiction. That isn't a matter of experience. That isn't a matter of summarizing or generalizing. It's a matter of insight into the nature of the logical laws. Well, this is Husserl's tour de force, as it were, his critique of psychologism in the first volume of the Logical Investigations. Any comments or questions or?
Maybe we can also involve you.
We can,
The people who are
oh, yeah.
from home. So in case anybody has questions from home, you're welcome to raise your hand. Do you want to manage this, or do you want me to?
Do I just press on it when they do?
Yeah. But no one's.
No one's
Sorry.
showing up? Okay. So maybe mention a couple of historical notes quickly here. One is that the neo-Kantians, who were a major force in early 20th century German philosophy, they agreed with the Prolegomena, the arguments we've just gone through in the book. They said this is right. But they thought that when Husserl then turned to write his own 6 logical investigations, he fell back into the psychologist trap. So it's very Paul, I think it was Natorp, was it? Or no? Natorp or Cohen, one of the Marburg neo-Kantians, said, well, this is all well and good, but we agree with you that psychology, that logic's not reducible to psychology. But then what are you doing in the rest of logical investigations but giving accounts of human intentionality that are supposed to ground logic? So, you know, you're taking it away with the one hand, and you're giving it back with the other. So the neo-Kantians accepted the first part of the logical investigations, but not the next 6 volumes. So it's interesting that part of it. Husserl was, I don't think Husserl was pandering at all, but he does need to favor the neo-Kantians in political terms. Psychology was a science which was growing by leaps and bounds, and if someone might help me here, but I think it's the Logos journal was an attempt to ward off psychology taking over positions in philosophy departments. It was part of a strategy to stop that from happening. Because, well, if you can reduce logic to psychology, then why should philosophy departments be independent of psychology? Shouldn't they be part of psychology? And I think it was Husserl, this is the only time Husserl joined hands with the neo-Kantians was in the establishing of Logos, the journal. With what must rigorous science begin was Husserl's article, but it was precisely this attempt to, make sure that philosophy is not reduced to psychology, particularly empirical psychology. So this was a struggle going on in the early 20th century in German universities. Yes, sir.
The question about when you said at the beginning of this brilliant construction that constructed, you said that there is no evidence that also endorsed some kind of psychology in the philosophy of Republic magic, right? And so I just partly this think that it's so important that he will say Prolegomeni. But I was wondering whether it is so this what he says. And I was wondering whether what he also says is related to the idea that actually he tries to inquire about the genesis of certain knowledge that we have, certain kinds of knowledge, like arithmetic ones. And at this stage of his work, he thinks he associates genesis of something with a psychological investigation of some sort, but then later on he realized that one can carry out genetic investigation to something without relapsing into a psychologistic position, but this time it is not able to keep separate the two aspects. So, and I mean that is my naive reading of this self-criticism, but I was curious of knowing your thought on this.
Yes, so that's a great question. I can't answer it fully, but I can suggest some things to you. So he does talk about static and dynamic accounts of knowledge in the sixth logical investigation. So he distinguishes the two. But what you're referring to is a more radical development in Husserl. And this is something which he develops, I think it's in the 20s. I don't know if it's before the 20s. But he talks about, he writes a text which was published as the analysis of passive synthesis. So this would be a passive synthesis, meaning it's prejudgmental in some way, and the active synthesis would be the kind of judgments and syllogisms that we're talking about in the logical investigation. So this is about how complexes of unities of complexes of sensations form passively before we make judgments about them. That would be the active. So I'm trying to remember how to put this. It's been a while since I read these texts, but I think you could see that there might be an experience of something forming a group or something creating a feeling in you before you've made any judgments about it. There's a kind of prejudgmental synthesis. That's what's called passive synthesis. I don't myself know. I couldn't give you a demonstration of how these two are related, and yet that's the crucial question. But he does talk about it, and that's not the same. That's a move beyond the logical investigations of 1900, 1901. I'm pretty sure this is a collection of manuscripts, but I think it's after 1920. It shows that Husserl never stood pat. He's moving. He's a moving target all the time. But he's recognizing that there's ways in which unities form themselves in consciousness in prejudgmental ways before we make judgments about it. When we come to active syntheses, as I recall, these are what we were studying just now: judgments, inferences, logical acts that we perform. Those are active syntheses. But if I were to say that this is Burgundy, is it Rosso or Burgundy? Rosso? What would you call it? Rosso. Okay, this is Rosso. Before I say this is Rosso, there is a collection of data that form a unity passively. I'm not making a judgment about it. The unity presents itself to me. So that's the passive synthesis. Now I have to have the passive synthesis to make the active synthesis, to make the judgments, but that's what he moves towards partly in the 20s. But that's like sometimes people talk about Husserl's genetic phenomenology. It's that particular part. What we're doing in logical investigations it doesn't, as far as I understand it, doesn't have that aspect to it. He's talking about active judgments and inferences, which we make. The act of judging, the act of making an inference presupposes ideal unities that are not the same as empirical unities. That's why you can get an ideal validity if P and Q, P therefore Q, and that's not based on a generalization from experience, inductive generalization. It's a great question. It's the best I can do. You can see though, Husserl is a moving target. By the time we get to this, making this compatible with the logical investigations itself, an interesting challenge. But thanks for the question. Anyone else? Yes.
Because in the same direction of this question, but I was wondering, according to you, does something change in Husserl's conception of this absolute independence of logic when it comes to the genetic approach to it? Because I was thinking about this discussion of the principle of the excluded middle in the permanent absolute logic, in which the universal validity of the principle depends on the fact that the terms of within the judgment have something to do with one another, and so that they respect the material a priori of the world.
Yeah, so the question is whether there's a development there. Yeah, I think there is. I couldn't spell it out for you right now, but I think that's certainly the case. So sometimes people will distinguish Husserl's genetic phenomenology from what we were talking about now. And that does come about in unpublished manuscripts, mostly the later get published in the Husserliana. And one would be, well, formal transcendentology was certainly published, I think. But there we do have the results of those writings which he was making, those investigations he was making, being published. So that's why, I don't know if you know the story that in between 1936 and 1938, Husserl's works were smuggled into Belgium. And the guy named the name of, I don't know if I remember his name, Breda.
Van Breda.
Carlos?
Van Breda.
Van Breda. He collected them, and that's brought them to Belgium, to Leuven, and that's where the Husserl archives are. So the 66 volumes of the Husserliana were originally published there. Why did I bring that up? My point was, I guess the point was that Husserl was developing this, some people call it, there's actually an American writer who calls it the silent Husserl, and has to do with the development of genetic phenomenology, whereas the published works mostly don't give you that. Although that's not completely true, even though the 6 logical investigations, you can distinguish between static and dynamic counter truth. But anyway, the idea is that this is a later development of his thought, at least explicitly. And I had some other thought I was going to get across, but the Husserliana does show this development of Husserl. Many scholars spend their time. Other answer to the question. I'm sorry, I'm out of the way. Yeah, so there is this interesting discussion of passive constitution, passive synthesis. And so this is a later development, but it does take care of things that they're not exactly unconscious, but they're not thematically conscious. So you don't make a judgment about a collection of things on the table, but you receive them as a collection. So there's a synthesis which is prejudgmental. Before I say the bottles are on the table, I'm collecting them they're forming a collection that is in a way passively registered by me, which then is available though then for judgments. So for active synthesis. This is the unpublished part of Husserl, Husserliana. Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, I was wondering if the difference, there is actually a difference. I was wondering what the difference is between Husserl's ideas unities and Frege's third realm of entities, which hold for objective sense of proposition as contrasted to our subjective representation a bit. I was wondering if Husserl operates modifications of this suggestion, which come from Husserl, from Frege, or they are actually similar and so on.
I don't know the answer to that question, but some people interpret the third realm as something, Frege's third realm. And so between the act and the object, there's the ideal entities or the ideal structures. Some people say that Husserl doesn't need to commit himself to that. So that's already an ontological determination which Husserl doesn't make. Now, maybe he needs to make it. That would be another matter. And there you'd have debates between Fregeans and Husserlians on that third realm. So it's a great question, but I can't give a straightforward, I can't say that. I mean, Husserl recognizes that when you have the act of seeing, you've got the object seen, but then in between is the way it is seen. So you can't reduce the seeing to either the act or the object. There has to be this way in which the object is taken up. And you might argue that that leads you ultimately to Frege's third realm. So it's not the same as the act of seeing red, and it's not the seeing red, it's the redness that informs both the act and the object. I'm not sure that Husserl would have to be committed to that, but it is an interesting question, and it is. There's a fellow, Dagfinn Fullestall, who used to say that they come together at that point, former Harvard professor. But I'm sorry, I can't give you, that's the best I can do. It's a really great question. Is Husserl ultimately committed to the third realm, a Fregean third realm or not? I kind of doubt it, but it is one way to interpret it. I have a friend, he's a fairly old fellow now, Bob Sokolowski, who's a much better Husserl scholar than I am. And he thinks that the best way to make sense of Husserl in the end is as a Platonist. And that suggests closeness to the third realm. But thanks for the question. It's a great question.
Thank you.
Okay. The rain here. Well, let me ask a question before we close. Was there something that about what we talked about that was particularly unclear, that has to be said otherwise, or that seemed very confused? I mean, we're crossing language barriers here, and a major philosopher, so it'd be helpful if there was something that didn't seem right. Okay, well, thank you for your attention and coming. I hope I see you tomorrow.
That's tomorrow, right? And tomorrow it's at 5:30 because there's a class that's many before President's Day.
So how long? 5:30 to 7?
It should be to 8, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, we have the room from 5:30 to 8. You can make it last.
So what my plan for the next meeting is to very briefly go through the 6 logical investigations, just say what's in each of them. And then move to the introduction to ideas 1. And we'll do the first section of ideas 1, which is on facts and essences, material and formal ontology. So that's my plan for tomorrow. But thanks for your attention.
By the way, Professor Dahlstrom is very generous with his time, and if any one of you would like to talk to him about Husserl or about, whatever philosophical topics you have in mind that might be of interest to you and to Professor Dahlstrom. We can set up appointments. I already told him that he should feel free to use my office upstairs. So it's up to you if you want to introduce yourself to Professor Dahlstrom and talk to him about, I don't know, many of you, for example, I know are working on Husserl or on Heidegger or on topics that he's an expert of. Please feel free to do so. Thank you to everybody at home, and so we'll see you tomorrow, 5:30 tomorrow. Good night.